Hi, my name is Max, and my presentation will be on coal as a fuel source. Coal plays a major role in our everyday lives. As far back as 2,000 years ago, coal was used to cook food and heat homes. And now it helped push the world forward as the staple behind the Industrial Revolution, helping to move the factory line and create all sorts of amazing things. And even now today, it's still one of the major sources of energy, being the third largest producer of electricity in the world. So what exactly is coal that it was so effective at burning? Well, unlike the natural gases and petroleums that we use now, in the fuel oils, coal is actually a really big molecule. So petroleum especially is actually relatively small. It's called an alkane substance, which means it's just carbon and hydrogen in simple sigma bonds. And as you can see here, coal is considerably more complicated. And also it contains double bonds, so not just simple sigma bonds. And it also contains impurities, such as sulfur and nitrogen, which then cause lots of emissions. This is actually just a picture of one type of coal. As I'm about to show, there's actually lots of types of coal that burn very differently and have very different emissions. So there's four main categories of coal. Anthracite, which is the oldest. It's a very brittle hard rock that's over 300 million years old. And it contains 86 to 97% carbon, so that's a really high density of carbon. It also burns the cleanest, and it's considered the highest grade of coal, but it's extremely rare, especially in the United States. So it's not used very often unless someone's really trying to cut down on emissions. Then come the next two categories, which are the really big ones, as you can see. Bituminous, which is the next oldest rock and next highest in carbon, which is 45 to 86% carbon. And so bituminous and subbituminous are pretty similar in a lot of ways. Subbituminous is just a bit newer, and often it actually burns cleaner than the bituminous. But the main difference is it has a higher water content. So it doesn't burn as nicely, and it's a bit harder to combust, and there's more byproducts, such as boiler slag and bottom end. And lastly, there's lignite, which is very young coal. I suppose if you're talking in millions of years, it can't really be young, but it's the newest coal, and it's not used very often. Luckily, it also isn't a very large percentage of coal, but it leaves a lot of residue and burns very uncleanly due to just huge amounts of water. Because of all these impurities in coal, it has a lot of effects on the environment, especially the sulfur oxides and the nitrogen oxides. The sulfur oxides and nitrogen oxides both together produce acid rain, which is when, of course, they go into the atmosphere, and then they react with water and other chemicals in the atmosphere, and then rain down as acids, which can just absolutely destroy ecosystems and have a horrible effect on areas surrounding power plants. And then nitrogen oxides also react with other chemicals in the atmosphere to produce what's called ground level ozone. This one isn't as well known, but it's kind of like that smog that surrounds big cities, especially cities where there isn't a lot of wind. So nitrogen oxides also come from car emissions and stuff like that, which is why it's so common in cities. But coal power plants are also a big producer of that. And then of course, because of the high carbon content, when coal burns, it also releases a lot of carbon dioxide. So in 2012, coal represented 24.5% of all CO2 emissions in the United States, but it only represented 18% of power produced. So obviously it burns fairly uncleanly compared to other sources of energy. So to combat these emissions, what the United States did, and a couple other countries signed on to this as well, such as Great Britain, is they created the CAAA, which is the Clean Air Act Amendment. And this just tried to limit specifically the amount of sulfur that left power plants. And so a lot of power plants decided to take kind of like a temporary approach and just use anthracite, which is the more rare coal and burns more cleanly. Whereas others implemented more permanent solutions, such as the FGD, flue gas desulfurization system. This is by far the most common system used now to help control emissions. And it's fairly effective. Most of them filter out about 90% of emissions. And the problem is they produce more byproducts. So as you're about to see, you might not be able to see this very well, but it's just a list of the different types of FGD systems. And the most common of which is limestone. So what happens is they pulverize limestone, then they mix it with hydroxide in water and create calcium hydroxide slurry. And then once the emissions are in the flue gas, they just spray the slurry on it, and the calcium reacts with the sulfur to create calcium sulfate, also known as gypsum, which is the powder you see there. The problem is you can only use it once, and then you have gypsum, and then you have to do something with the gypsum. So it produces more byproducts, or as I was in the last slide, coal combustion products. So that would be boiler slag, bottom ash, fly ash, any emissions of any sort, and in this case FGD materials. So the problem is that a lot of these coal combustion products aren't handled very well. This graph just shows the percentage of the products that are used. So like a lot of them have secondary uses, like gypsum can be used in drywall and other building materials. And boiler slag especially is actually worth quite a bit, and it's used in tar. So in streets, roofing, stuff like that. And the problem is, once you see these graphs for yourselves, is a lot of them aren't used up. Maybe like 30%, or in the case of FGD materials, only 5% are actually used up. So there's a lot of leftover that's just stored or held in areas. So at this point you might be thinking, if coal burns so terribly, why are we still using it as energy source? That's because coal is extremely reliable, and there's tons of reserves. For instance, in India, which is the third largest producer of coal, they only have 7% of the world's coal reserves, but coal is used to large amounts in India. Without coal, India could not really work out. So, and it's estimated that at the current rate of consumption, which is pretty high, they could easily last over 100 years on using the amount of coal they're using, which is over half of their energy source. So coal has huge reserves, and in places such as the US, which has far greater reserves, coal could be used much longer. And it's estimated that if the world relied on coal, as they are now, like not an increase or not a decrease, then the world could easily go on for 200 years using coal as a fuel source, because there are just such large quantities. At the end, of course, they'd be using lignite, which is just getting worse, but it's there, and as long as technology advances and more transmissions and emissions can be filtered out and the CCPs can be used up, then there's really no problem using coal, especially since the CCPs actually do have a use. So yeah. This video explains the process really well. It's just 6 minutes long, so if you took the time to watch my 10-minute video, you should probably take the time to watch this video too. It takes you to the Drax power plant in Great Britain, which uses the limestone FGD system. And it's just a quick run through of how they combust the coal and how exactly the system works. So like I said, it's just 6 minutes long, and I highly recommend you watch it. It's really helpful. And then these are my sources. Okay. I'm done. Turn it off.